Well, everyone, so just want to say hello. I hope that your week is going okay. You're almost done. We will have the midterm for this course next Wednesday. So I'm hoping that the extra time will allow you to get through this week and then be able to put some hours into studying the material. The breakdown of the midterm is located in the module section of Canvas for the course. And don't forget that there is the sample midterm. Now, there is the quizzes that gave you 100 different questions based on the material that would be covered in the midterm. Those types of questions are short answer. There's some matching ones, and they're very specific to the terminology in the textbook. The format of the questions that you'll be presented with in the midterm are like this sample, okay? And the breakdown of the number of questions per lecture is located in the midterm module section. And it'll kind of help you maybe focus the amount of time you want to spend on each lecture. Yeah, so the quizzes will be due before the midterm. Probably don't submit them because then they're gone, right? So use them to study and understand and then submit them before the midterm. So, not that I want to sort of put more into your minds before you have had a chance to really review all of the material for the midterm, but post-midterm lectures, so lectures 7, 8, 9, and 10, will be covering motor learning. And so this lecture, the topic of this lecture is an introduction to motor learning. I find that the material from the motor learning lectures is simpler. It's even more, how I would say, like intuitive or self-explanatory, or things that you've already noticed in terms of the material. Sort of just makes sense. That was true of some of the things in the motor control lectures, but I find that this is especially true with these lectures. So hopefully that means that it is easier for you to get through the material as well. So the breakdown of today's lecture is what you see on the slide here. We're going to first discuss and define learning and sort of the tools used to assess that. We're going to talk about two different theories on the stages of learning. One of them we've already talked about, and then we'll talk about this idea of transfer of learning. So let's first start off with defining and assessing learning. Now, the main sort of initial point that I wanted to get across is something that we've talked about in the motor control lectures as well, but that the assessment of learning is achieved through inferences while observing performance. So if I'm watching someone practice, I can infer through observation of watching them, right, that they're learning, but there's no sort of like way to sort of overtly register, oh, they are learning right now. You have to sort of infer it through observation. And then the way to test whether or not someone has learned something is through tests. And so we do that after the fact. So the way to test the way to understand if someone's learning during practice is through observing their performance and noticing maybe 6 different sort of observable traits. Does that make sense, everyone? Because remember, when I'm watching someone perform a motor skill, so give me a motor skill, Jacob. A motor skill that you want to learn. Sure, swimming. So I'm going to watch you swim. I can watch your performance and then look at how you're doing in real time, right? But if I was just to watch you do a couple laps, can I know for sure that you're learning? I would have to observe your performance over multiple days or multiple sessions, right? Learning isn't directly observable. It's more dependent on sort of assessing performance and how that changes over time. And so by definition, yeah, there you go. Oh, you're answering my question. Thanks, Jacob. Oh, there's 20 of us now. So learning as a definition is a change in the capability to perform a skill that must be inferred from a relatively permanent improvement in performance as a result of practice. So remember we talked about like sort of the process of learning. It involves practice or the repetition of a motor skill, which leads to a relatively permanent improvement in the capability to achieve that skill. So what research has described are observable characteristics that you can sort of recognize that will infer to us that learning is happening. Those include improvement, consistency, stability, persistence, adaptability, and reduced attention demands. So we'll go through examples of each of those. So the first one is that, let's say we're talking about Jacob swimming, right? So if I'm going to evaluate your performance and rate it, as you are learning, as you're getting better, what would be the change in performance or a performance variable that we would see? So I don't know, what kind of swimming do you want to do? Like speed? Yeah. Okay. So let's say we're judging his performance on swimming for speed. So as he gets better and better, we're going to notice a change in performance or an improvement in a performance variable, right? So that's probably the easiest one to sort of consider. Now, one thing though is that you can develop bad habits. So sometimes you can learn bad habits. So technically, it's not always a performance improvement. Technically, someone can learn a bad habit and you would notice maybe a performance variable decreasing. The second characteristic is consistency. And so what we'll notice is that performance becomes increasingly more consistent with successive attempts, right? So when we talked about learning motor skills, we can talk about swimming, but do we all understand that as you become better and better at a motor skill, your consistency in how wide your performance is decreases. So you become more and more consistent in your ability to achieve, the goal of the task as you become better and better, or you learn a motor skill. Does everyone understand that? When we were looking at the slide where it had the two darts, or no, I think it was darts, or was it golf? Where one group had a whole bunch. They were off to the center, but they were all sort of close together. That was more consistency versus the golf diagram at the bottom was more variable. As you become better, you're more consistent in your motor skill. Stability is a sort of term to describe that with learning, the performer becomes better able to resist internal and external perturbations and still complete the task. So think of different sort of like conditions that can change as you're performing this skill, right? So internally, stress, arousal, multitasking, you become more able to still complete a motor skill under a widening range of internal conditions. And the same is true of external conditions as well. So as you become better and better at a motor skill, you can complete that task under a widening range of external conditions. Does that make sense? Okay. Persistence is the fourth characteristic. And persistence is sort of relating to that idea that as we learn something, it's a relatively permanent improvement in performance. So as we get better and better at a motor skill, we have our improved ability for longer amounts of time. So when we are first practicing a skill, you will start the practice session, you'll improve by the end of the practice session. And then, so let's say we're like learning karate, and the next practice is like a full week. When you're first learning, there's going to be a detriment from when you finish off one practice session to the next one. But as you get better and better, the drop in performance in between sessions decreases because we have a persistence of that learning. Does that make sense? Perfect. Adaptability. So adaptability is similar to stability, but adaptability is sort of suggesting that when you get better and better at a motor skill, you are able to adapt the motor skill to new and different context situations. So when I am, so I can, let's say I'm getting better and better at a motor skill, let's say basketball, then every game is a new situation, right? I can still perform equally as well under newer and changing conditions. Adaptability is like stability, but think of stability as perturbations, or like as you're performing a motor skill, things are going to happen. Whereas adaptability is talking about the whole novel context. And then the last one, the sixth characteristic, is related to automaticity, which we sort of discussed last day with attention, that as you get better and better at something, it requires technically less attention to complete. And so for that reason, we were talking about that as you get better at something, you're able to multitask while doing it. There's a reduced attention demand of a motor skill as we perform better. Conversely, as we are learning a motor skill, it takes more attention to complete or practice. Does it make sense? Perfect. So let's talk about different learning assessment techniques then. And so if we're going to describe ways to confirm that learning has occurred, it involves testing, right? And so the learning assessment techniques that have been most utilized in research, and in specifically the research that is available in that textbook, they are talking about the different assessment techniques such as the observing practice performance we've talked about. Retention tests are recall tests and recognition tests, just like in an exam. So you're testing material. Transfer tests is putting someone in a novel situation and seeing if they can adapt. So that would be more like practice versus game. And then coordination dynamics is a way researchers tried to look at a way to evaluate coordination changes, because technically, as you become better and better at a motor skill, your coordination in terms of the movements that are utilizing tend to sort of like come together. Maybe there's a way to test that. And so these are the 4 different ways that were discussed in research. So the first one is through observing practice performance. So we have the 6 observable characteristics that we would infer learning has happened. But what about if we wanted to come up with a quantifiable number? The easiest way to do that is performance curves. And do you guys remember performance outcome, performance production measures? If we use performance outcome measures, we can graph them over time. So do you remember any of the performance outcome measures? There was a bunch of them, but here's some examples: error, reaction time, distance, speed, score, goals. right? As long as we have a quantifiable number that would infer or sort of be used to rate someone's performance in a motor skill, you can map or you can graph that change in performance of that measure over time. And so this would give us a sort of a visual of improvement and consistency, because look at this example here. So here we're graphing error. So do any of you remember root mean squared error? It was a sort of an error measure that we talked about with continuous skills. But here we have a measurement of error. So high error is bad, low error is good. Here we are graphing that error measurement over time. And the time would be each number of trials. So here we can see that the error decreases over time with practice. What's another thing that we notice, right? So if the value is decreasing, that's improvement. We can see towards the end that the scores are much closer together. They're less variable. So it's a measurement of consistency. Here we have a potential of 4 different curves. Which of the 4 curves do you think is most typical of motor skills? Now, this would be looking at whether or not we're using an outcome measure where a high number is good. So not error, but let's say it was goals or I don't know, speed. Which of these curves most represents the change in performance over time? It's actually this one, yeah. So you get it is B, this one. So you get early huge increases in improvement, and then it sort of levels out over time. Like this. Negatively accelerated. So that's using outcome measures. So performance outcome measures. Using production measures is a lot more difficult, because if we're using for example, a kinematic measure, so like joint angle over time, you can't represent performance with one number, right? You have so let's say this is displacement of a joint over time. This would be one trial. Right, the trial lasting 5 seconds. So one thing that you can do in research that has been done in research in the textbook is what they do is they take a block of trials and then average them out. And so they would create an illustration for a block of trials. So let's look at this hypothetical study. So this was 1983. And in this study, what they were doing is they were looking at the displacement, displacement of the body. So they had to use a lever, and then they had to follow along a path. Lever, path. So they had to follow along this path. So what they did was they averaged out that kinematic profile for trials 1 through 10, 271 to 280, 511 to 520, and then 751 to 760. And so so each one of these is an average of 10 different trials. Well, what can you see here? So the dotted lines are the standard deviation. So this is as they were first practicing. You see this huge variation. So not very consistent, and it doesn't really match. So they are inaccurate and they don't have consistency. Now let's look at the next trial. So after 200 other practice trials, see how the shape is getting similar to what it should look like, and they're getting more consistent because the standard deviation bars are closer. Look at this group, even better. And then by the last one, by trials 751 to 760, that average, look how consistent. So it very much resembles the pattern that they're trying to do. And the error bars are very, very close. So it's very consistent. Does that make sense? So that would be trying to do, because remember, performance curves is a way to sort of visually assess learning. Typically, you can do performance curves using outcome measures. If you did want to use kinematic measures, it's much more difficult because you can't describe one trial with one number. You have to use something like this. The next type of assessment is retention tests. And so retention tests are a test or making you perform the motor skill that you've learned after a length of time. So you're testing the permanence or the permanence of learning of that motor skill. Now, academic skill is different than motor skill, obviously, but the concept is very much similar, and it's useful for an analogy. So we are going to have a midterm in this course next week because it's going to assess whether or not you've learned the material, right? If Jacob was practicing swimming all semester, right? He's been practicing in his swimming practice session every Wednesday. Next week, I'm going to have him swim in a pool, and I'm going to rate him. It's testing what you've been trying to practice. Does that make sense? Transfer tests are different. Transfer tests are what you do is you involve using a novel situation in which the performer must adapt the skill they've learned into characteristics of a new situation. The most common example of that is sports, right? You are practicing the different skills of the sport, and then the game is always a brand new situation. So you've been doing all of this practicing. You can try to like mimic game type situations, but the person that's learned the most is going to be able to adapt those skills and perform just as well or even better in a real game situation. And the game situation is a brand new situation because it's always random, right? It's always new. Does that make sense? Think about a rehab setting. So we are having a stroke patient, and the stroke patient is having significant difficulty initially in picking up objects and manipulating them, prehension tasks. And so what we would do is we would have them practice lifting and grabbing and manipulating a whole range of different objects, moving, not moving, different sizes, different shapes. And then the next day we could test their learning by giving them a brand new object that they've never practiced with before, but seeing how they do. You're testing the adaptability of their skill. So when performing transfer tests into a new, because sometimes it's difficult, like, well, how am I going to change like a bench press? How do you give them, I want to test how much they've learned in bench press. How do I adapt a new one? So a transfer test can involve one of two things: performing a practice skill in a context or situation different from the practice situation, or it's performing a skill that is a novel variation of the practice skill. So you could have them, so you've been practicing, let's say, darts, right? In your basement. Practicing darts, practicing darts, practicing darts, practicing darts, practicing darts, okay? And the test is going to be in a brand new place, a new environment, right? At the bar, when there's going to be the competition. You could do, so with like cops and firefighters, you practice the skills, and then they'll try and during a testing, try and increase the stress, because obviously those jobs, they are working under conditions that are very stressful. So the transfer test to test whether or not they're learning their firefighting skills is they make it very stressful when they're doing the test. And so that's going to test the adaptability of whether or not they've learned those skills and can apply it when, there's a significant internal stress level increase. The other thing that you could do is you can remove feedback. So augmented feedback is feedback that you're provided that is outside of what you can normally perceive. So like coach's advice, a mirror image, a mirror showing you how you're moving, or looking at like training wheels, right? So training wheels is augmented feedback because it's not allowing it. So it's you feel like the bike being able to sway back and forth, and it stops you, right? So it's letting you know the limits of when you can sort of lean. So the transfer test would be removing any of that feedback and seeing how well they perform. Is everyone okay? Perfect. And so the last one is testing coordination or coordination dynamics. And so researchers wanted to look at ways or different ways to sort of provide a measurement of coordination. And then you can use that to map learning because you can see how the coordination was changing over time. And the reason why they wanted to do this is because the general sort of theme of motor control, but also motor learning, is that as we begin to learn a new skill, we utilize the old coordination patterns that we already have like stored, right? So that whole sort of example of if you have a baseball player and you give them a racket and a tennis ball, they're going to try to swing at it and hit it like a baseball because that is what they're used to. Your body initially tries to complete a new motor skill using skills that it has learned previously. And then part of learning is being able to change that coordination and adapt it to the new skill that you're learning. Does that make sense? So in terms of coordination, learning as a measurement or as an assessment is going to involve changing the initial movement coordination to the new coordination pattern. It's difficult to come up with measurements in that way, just because it is so like skill dependent, right? So you could look at kinematics, you could look at sort of like measurements like this, where in this study, what the goal was to do was, it was like an Etch-a-Sketch, except you're using levers like this, and you had to draw a circle, but the levers were out of phase. So is Etch-a-Sketch even a thing that you guys remember? You have to like do both at once. It's hard to try to do a circle with an Etch-a-Sketch. It's hard, you gotta go one at a time, right? So they're arguing that you could use that as a sort of demonstration of coordination and looking at how it's different over time. Oops. I think I'm missing a slide. 1 second. And maybe later on. Okay. So, is everyone okay so far? Now, practice performance, the next thing that I wanted to get across is that now that we have observable characteristics to sort of suggest to us that people are learning, right? These 6 characteristic changes that we can observe that would infer to us that, oh, we can see that these people have been learning, right? We also have now 4 types of measurements that we can create to assess learning, right? Performance curves, retention tests, transfer tests, and coordination dynamics. However, practice performance using these measures and observations may misrepresent learning. And that's for 2 reasons. Practice may involve a performance variable that artificially inflates or deflates performance. So maybe they're provided feedback that they're always going to do better in practice situation because they're getting like hints, or they are, they're getting coached at the same time. So you may think, oh wow, their performance measurement that we're measuring is so much better, but they may not be learning because they're relying more on sort of the practice environment. The other thing is that there may be performance plateaus, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So here we have an example of this idea that performance measurements may artificially alter performance. Here we had a special motor skill study where what they wanted to do was they wanted people to practice using crutches by placing 30% of their body weight on their foot while the other foot was up and they were holding crutches, okay? So they're using a force plate. They had to practice being able to put 30% of their body weight on the foot while the rest of the weight was on the crutches, okay? So they had different sessions and they would practice for the whole session and then they would measure their performance. And so the three different groups were people that were able to visualize how much weight was on the foot because they got a display from the force plate. So they were in real time always aware of how much force was on the foot. So it was guiding them. KR1 and KR5 is knowledge of results. So in this group, they were provided feedback. So they would practice, and they would stop, and then they were provided feedback by a coach of saying, oh, it was actually this percentage. After every trial, knowledge of results 5 means they were given feedback after every 5 trials. What they did was, so they practiced for a session, and then they came back, I think, a day later, and then they would test to see how well the participants did without any feedback. So based on this part of the graph right here, which of the groups did the best? If this is error, so AE is absolute error. Which of the groups performed the best during practice? Right. Okay. Right? Because they could visualize what the weight was on their foot the whole time. So of course they did the best. Which group did the best in the testing situation? Now keep in mind the testing situation was when they were given no feedback. So there was no display, or the other two groups, they weren't given coaching tips. Strange, right? Because you would have thought based on performance that this group would have done the best. But because in the testing situation, they weren't given any feedback, KR5, meaning that they were only given feedback every 5 trials, they were forced to help and learn themselves better. So it led to more learning. So now this is an example of how sometimes performance during practice isn't the whole picture. Right. So what we're going to learn, this is like in 2 lectures from now, it's initially good to give them lots of feedback, but you want to start taking that away because part of the learning experience is being able to solve the skill for yourself. So you want to give less feedback as you continue the learning to have the participant figure things out for themselves. And that's going to lead to better learning. Does that make sense? Perfect. The other reason why performance during practice isn't the whole picture or may artificially like inflate or deflate learning is this whole concept of performance plateaus. So have you ever sort of experienced yourself or observation a time when you're learning a motor skill and then there's a period of time where performance doesn't really change? Now, would you argue that in those performance plateaus that learning has stopped? performance vary, but like the measurement of performance may show the same score, but is learning stopped during that situation? And the reason that research has sort of evaluated this is because it's common in different types of motor skills. And researchers have debated what the reason behind this is. And performance plateaus, or periods of time in which there appears to be no further performance improvement, can occur for one of three reasons. It could represent a period of transition between phases of acquiring certain aspects of the skill. So it might indicate that the participant has put stuff together and they're trying to now alter their coordination dynamics. So in this time, the score of performance is increasing, but they're really changing their coordination, or they are integrating, the regulatory features with vision better, or there's something happening in that time where they're still learning, they're integrating information, but it's not directly relating to improved performance at that time. The second thing second reason why performance plateaus may occur is because it could be a period of time when there's poor motivation or lack of attention, or the person is fatigued, right? And a general theme with motor learning is that unless the person is paying attention to what they're doing, they're not learning. And so performance plateaus may represent a period in time where the person is getting bored. And so if you, as a coach, recognize, or as a practitioner or as a therapist, you recognize that there's a sort of plateau in performance, it may be a time where you're supposed to make them take a break or help motivate them to keep focusing on what they're doing. And then the last reason why performance plateaus may occur is a ceiling or floor effect, or maybe the measurement that you are using to describe their performance, it may max out. Like, think about like those, like at a fair, those punching machines, and then like it rates your punch strength, or the hammer gives you a strength performance. So there's a max score. So the people that, just because I hit a max score and you hit a max score, are we the same strength? No, we just both maxed out on the available measurement. It's a ceiling effect. So there's probably a better measurement that could be used to see the difference in performance. So does that make sense, everyone, in terms of performance plateaus? So there's observable characteristics to infer that we're learning. We can measure it through those 4 performance type measurements, but measuring performance during practice doesn't always let us know that they are learning, because of potentially the performance variable is inflating or deflating performance levels or performance plateaus. Okay, awesome. So now let's talk about the different stages of learning. Now, we talked about the Fitz and Posner model of learning, the 3-stage model. In the initial lecture, I had a video and they described the stages of learning. I think we talked about it later on in that lecture as well. And then Gentile, remember Gentile's taxonomy? That group developed a 2-stage model of learning. So there's 2 different models to describe the stages of learning, and they're both similar and talking about different things. They're both similar in that they're talking about the same things. They just look at different aspects. Gentile's taxonomy was really, really concerned with regulatory conditions and how to alter them based on learning a stepwise increase in, skill difficulty. Remember, because the Gentile's taxonomy was from a sort of rehab setting and being used or being developed to be used in that environment. Fitz and Posner was coming in from like a behavioral psychological sort of perspective. But we'll see that they're both similar in talking about the same aspects. And so the Fitz and Posner three-stage model, this was done in 1967, and it proposed that motor skill learning, or going from beginner to expert, involved 3 stages of learning: the cognitive stage, the associative stage, and the autonomous stage. So think about a motor skill that you learned to do even recently, but when you were young. Initially, when you are learning a motor skill, you are determining what to do and how to do it. You're cognitively trying to focus on what is required in terms of your movement to achieve the goal. Coaching can guide you, but let's say, remember the baby? What happens if you were given a ball and, okay, basketball, there's the hoop. Your goal, get the ball in the hoop, practice. And then you're left alone to practice that skill and figure it out in isolation with no help. You're going to look at the ball. What were you going to do? You probably throw it, try to figure it out. And through repetition, you're going to solve what to do and how to do it to become more and more consistent in trying to do that skill. So the cognitive stage is marked by many gross errors and a loss or a lack of consistency. And that is the person, trying to learn from every repetition, every trial. Okay, well, I should have done this. I should have done that. That seems to work. That doesn't seem to work. That's why it's called the cognitive stage. It involves, the sort of cognition or mental processing. Does that make sense, everyone? Because the key in motor learning is that this cognitive stage is what solidifies the permanence of learning. Because you're solving all of the different troubleshooting or problem-solving issues in your brain and figuring it out for yourself, all of that information leads to a better understanding of the skill. So that's why when I say when you're studying academics, test yourself. Test yourself from different angles of the different material, because it's going to be annoying at first, but it's going to give you a more solidified sort of awareness of that topic. The cognitive stage is what really helps formulate the initial stages of learning and is sort of the baseline foundation of what's required to reach to the automatic or expert stage. The second stage of learning is the associative stage. And this is where the person's already figured out what to do and basically how to do it. And now this is the refining stage, where they have the basic fundamentals of the skills, and they're refining their performance to become more consistent. They're refining their performance to become more efficient, and they are refining their performance to be able to figure out how to react to the different things in the environment, or how different regulatory conditions will affect their performance. So if the ball was further away, they have to throw it harder till they get to the hoop, for example, with our baseball or with our basketball example. So the associative stage is the refining stage. So the last stage then would be, after all of that practice, you reach the autonomous stage. And this is the final stage where the performance of the skill becomes automatic. And this is sort of grossly associated with automaticity, where you have now a lack of attention required to complete that task, and you're now able to multitask this skill with other skills. This is where the autonomous stage, where in sports, the game slows down. They don't need to look at what they're doing anymore. They know they figured out how to dribble. Now they can look up and they can sort of be more aware of the environment. One key point with the autonomous stage is that not all performers would reach the automatic stage. Did you ever hear the term practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect? And that is highly relatable to this information in terms of motor learning, right? To reach the autonomous stage, it is going to make sure that you still have to figure out what's lacking and put attention or emphasis on practicing different aspects. It's like a sort of spectrum or a continuum where you have to get good at everything, and then all of that practice and all of the different areas of that motor skill will be put together. That's when you reach the autonomous stage. So studying itself, reading the lectures, doesn't make you the perfect student for a course. It depends on the student, but studying the lectures, answering yourself questions, teaching others, I don't know what cue cards. Some people do, so you go over the lectures and changing the order. Is everyone okay? So that was Gentile's, that was the Fitz and Posner model. So that's 3 stages. Gentile's two-stage model is similar. It just involves 2 stages. So they describe learning as the initial stage and the later stages, right? So in the initial stage, the person or participant or learner is figuring out what to do, right? They organize movement patterns to enable some degree of success. And at the end of this stage, so in this case would be the end of the associative stage. So at the end of the initial stage, they're able to discriminate in the environment between regulatory and non-regulatory conditions. So at the end of this stage, the learner has developed an effective approach, but they still lack consistency and efficiency. So they still need to refine their movements, but in the initial stages, they have figured out what to do through experience and repetition, and now they're able to understand, okay, regulatory conditions, non-regulatory conditions. And the reason why Gentile came up with this 2-stage model was because, you guys remember from the 2 axes in the Gentile's taxonomy, they were talking about regulatory conditions. So that's why right here, regulatory, non-regulatory conditions. And then in the later stages of Gentile's 2-stage model, they suggest it involved 3 characteristics. They can now adapt that performance to any performance situation. They've developed consistency, and they've developed efficiency in their movement. But there is a difference in the type of skill and how the sort of refining stage would occur based on the type of motor skill. So they were saying that in closed motor skills, in the later stages, you develop a fixation of movement pattern, that you, during closed motor skill or when things aren't moving. So in the later stages, you are, with repetition, really refining to make sure that you have consistency in your movement pattern. So something like darts or bowling, right? Bowling and darts is a closed motor skill. Nothing is moving initially, right? So it's always the same as you start off. So what they do is they fixate their movement patterns. They make sure that it's exactly the same every single time. Whereas with open motor skills are where different regulatory conditions are in motion. So the people in the environment, objects, and the supporting surface. And so in the later stages of a open motor skill, you have a diversification of movement pattern, that the person is focusing more on keeping their movement patterns changing to different environmental conditions. So their movement patterns are diversifying to be able to adapt that situation to every new characteristic or a new environmental condition that occurs with each trial. So both the Fitz and Posner and Gentile 2-stage model are similar in that they're talking about sort of the initial cognitive stage, learning what to do, how to do it, figuring out the regulatory conditions, and then developing sort of consistency and economy of effort to get to a point where it becomes automatic. However, with Gentile's 2-stage model, they are sort of trying to relate that to regulatory conditions, and talk about the differences in that stage, that later stage, and how that would change between open versus closed skills. Is that okay, everyone? Perfect. So this next part of the lecture, we're just going through and sort of highlighting the different performer and performance changes that would occur during the stages of learning. So we've talked about the observable characteristics of learning. Now let's talk about sort of examples of this in real life situations. So we've talked about how improvement changes over time. So we would see typically that the repetition of practicing a motor skill would lead to an initially large improvement in performance, and that performance sort of like exponentially sort of decreases or plateaus over time. That negatively accelerated pattern of motor learning. That's typical of learning motor skills. And here we have an example of, so this was a study done in 1959 where they looked at the performance of employees in a cigar factory, and the workers were rolling cigars, and they would look at how long it would take them to roll a cigar and map that out over 7 years of working in the facility. This is a logarithmic or log scale. So see how that's like 10,000 rolls, 100,000, 1 million, 10 million. So it's actually like extended this way. But you can see sort of initially there's a huge or larger rate of improvement, and then that sort of plateaus over time. Other things that we notice in people when they are sort of learning, remember there's changes in coordination. So as you become better and better at a motor skill, the body is moving more efficiently. Now, one thing that has been noticed in research is this idea of freezing the degrees of freedom. So do we all remember what the degrees of freedom problem was in motor control theories? The degrees of freedom was talking about sort of the number of moving elements, or the amount of movement available in a system. So when looking at the body, because there's so many joints, like if you think of like a door, the door has 2 ways it can go, right? Open, close. There's 1 degree of freedom, the hinge. Whereas my hand, there's flexion, extension of all the different joints, plus the metacarpals, plus the carpal bones. There's a huge range of much larger degrees of freedom of that sort of system. And so in terms of coordination, it must be hard for the body to try to determine the most efficient way to move all of those degrees of freedom. And what researchers have found out is that initially when people are learning a motor skill, they use a sort of technique called freezing the degrees of freedom. So here we have an example of someone, is that racquetball? Think of someone trying to learn an initial skill. What they'll do is, here we have an example of a racquetball player. This little kid, he's going to learn racquetball. So in an expert, hitting the ball with the racket is going to involve movement of the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, maybe the fingers, right? Plus the trunk. When initially moving or learning a motor skill, what participants do is they will sort of like freeze all of the joints except for one. So he would practice first just using his shoulder, right? Get used to that motion, and then over time, start unfreezing and using all of the other joints. By doing that, it decreases the complexity so they can try to solve coordination of one joint at a time. Does that make sense, everyone? So when evaluating the changes in coordination that happen over time while learning, maybe it's because of this sort of strategy that learners do, is that they are learning to unfreeze the joints and move them together. That is what happens. Everyone okay? Here we have another example of the freezing of degrees of freedom. So here we have a joint angle of the knee versus, or sort of graphed against the joint angle of the hip. And so see pre-practice versus post-practice. See how there's like a larger range of the line? That just means there was more movement. So pre-practice, they had freezing of the joint. They were moving the joints less. Whereas post-practice, this was learning a soccer kick. Right? So they're saying that when you learn to kick a ball, initially, you just use your knee, right? You're practicing, just use your knee. And then as you get better at it, then you can start using your hip. And that is what that graph is showing. Does that make sense, everyone? Can anyone come up with any other examples? Benjamin? Benny? What about Jacob? Golf swing. Yeah. Because so you tell me how that would work, I guess. Because initially they're probably just going to move their shoulder, right? And then over time, then they'll follow through, use their elbows and their wrist, core. Anything else? Yeah, their hips over time. Does that make sense, everyone? Perfect. Other things that we have noticed over time. So changes in muscles used. So sometimes they use EMG tests. You can use EMG and assess which muscles are being utilized. So over time, we may notice that there's more efficiency in the number of muscles used, that there's using less activation, and therefore that would relate to changes in energy cost. Can you think of a skill where initially when you're learning, it's very tiring, and then as you get better and better, it becomes less tiring? I'm trying to think. Can anyone think of any other examples? Is that true? It's very tiring, and then as you become more and more efficient, right, you probably use less muscles, your movements are more efficient, and therefore you are more, energy efficient. So the breathing. Okay. So you're basically, remember, you're refining your movements, and in this case, the refining is also related to, being more efficient with the muscle usage, right? And overall, the energy cost. So that would include breathing and the use of the muscles, right? So this is more muscles. This could be muscles plus breathing plus everything. Do you remember the Ronaldo video? So as you get better, there is an improvement in visual selective attention. So people are better at figuring out in the environment what they need to sort of focus in on visually to perform the task, and then they can do that much quicker. They get better in their visual selection process, or the visual search and selecting. And the last one we talked about, that as you become better and better, it reduces the amount of conscious attention required. In terms of changes in error detection and correction capability. So as you become better and better at a motor skill, you have to, that's why home meets are always better than away meets for swimming. For the, oh, visual wise, okay. Yeah. Oh, because you can better pick out what in the environment helps you. That makes sense. Do you want, let me, yeah. Do you understand how over time, when learning a motor skill, you're better at detecting your own errors or sort of like what's required to make a correction? One example of that is that as you become better and better at a motor skill, you less require vision, you can more rely on proprioception. You have a better awareness of your body and what's required to complete that task. Yep. And then the last thing that this is most relevant to like sort of what's happening now is with those MEG machines, what they're wanting to look at in terms of research for motor learning is changes in where the brain is active in the different stages of learning. So early on, we see that there's a lot of activity in the cerebellum because we're processing or we're improving that motor program that's stored in the cerebellum. And then through practice, it becomes automatic. And so there's still activity in the cerebellum, but the activity is decreased because there's less processing. It's automatic and it's more later in the basal ganglia, meaning it's more in the regulatory output. One thing to keep in mind is this practice specificity hypothesis. So whatever feedback or whatever sort of feedback that is available during practice becomes integrated in learning. So remember like a couple of slides ago, we were talking about the study where we had people with crutches learning to put on 30% of their weight on the stance foot. Those that had the display did best in practice, but learned the least. One thing to understand is that humans, when we're learning, will become dependent on whatever sensory information is available in practice. So you want the sensory feedback or the practice environment to most closely resemble the test environment or the real life situation. Does that make sense? Perfect. So the next part, we're going to quickly talk about expertise. So becoming an expert in a motor skill is going to be related, therefore, from all of the different sides that we've talked about thus far in this class. Remember this thing that this saying, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. And perfect practice is what's required to get to a stage of expertise. If you practice a skill long enough and with the right kind of instruction and making sure, like how many times have you guys heard this? He's a student of the game. LeBron is a student of the game. They're always cognitively trying to evaluate. Or Kobe was like always like, remember he did the those vignettes where he's a student of the game. He was always trying to learn more about his craft. It's those situations or being always giving attention to cognitively understanding errors or what can change or keeping focus on the skill. That's how you become an expert. An expert is someone who has sort of learned all the way to the very edge of sort of the learning continuum or the stages of learning. And common characteristics of experts in a particular skill are that the amount of time and type of practice. It's usually very long amount of practice and deliberate, intentional practice with optimal instruction that leads to someone becoming an expert. Experts generally have a better knowledge structure about the motor skill than beginners or amateurs. And when we talked about sort of the eye movement recording goggles and how those have been used in research to assess the differences between beginners and experts. Experts, because vision is so primary for humans, are much better able to pick out in the environment quicker with their vision than beginners. So these are sort of characteristics of experts. Now, because becoming a student of the game or maintaining sort of your attentional focus on the motor skill that you're practicing is required to become fully an expert in a particular motor skill, it's been argued that, how we were saying how in in the Fitz and Posner model of learning that you get to the cognitive stage, to the associative stage, to the automatic stage. It's argued that experts never reach the point of automaticity on purpose, because automaticity means that you aren't paying attention or you're having less or reduced attention to what you're doing. To become an expert, you purposely don't reach the automatic stage because you want to maintain attention on the skill you're doing so you can learn more and more and more. So you want to maintain a level of cognition to keep improving on your craft. Is that okay, everyone? So I just added that part in about experts, some characteristics of becoming an expert, but just understanding that it's argued that with learning, motor learning, the idea is that so much of it is cognitively problem solving. And so to get really good and continue to learning, you have to have that attention. And then the last couple of slides, we're going to be talking about transfer of learning and what that sort of means in relation to motor learning. So transfer of learning is a way to describe the influence of, or how the influence of previous experiments will affect our learning of a new skill or performing a skill in a new context. So there's 3 different types of influences that previous experience can have on learning a new skill. We can have a positive transfer, a negative transfer, or neutral transfer, or zero transfer. So positive transfer is when previous experience speeds up learning of a new skill. So people that have been figure skaters, that experience of learning to knowing how to skate, are going to learn quicker at playing hockey than those that have never skated before. Does that make sense? Positive transfer is when a previous experience influences positively the ability to learn a new skill. Negative transfer is when previous experience hinders or interferes with learning a new skill. And that example would be sort of someone that was a baseball player. They are so used to hitting a ball with a baseball bat that that's sort of ingrained, that movement pattern is ingrained. So initially when learning a new sport like tennis, they have a negative transfer of learning, or that previous experience initially, because they try to hit the tennis ball like a baseball, it has sort of like a negative effect on the learning the motor skill initially. And then through practice, they lose the old coordination from baseball. So the idea would be that someone who's never played any sort of racket sport before will initially learn quicker at tennis than someone who was a baseball player that is now changing to tennis. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, perfect. And then neutral transfer is when the skills are so different that has no effect. So my ability to drive that I've been driving for years has no effect on me learning how to play basketball. Right? So we have three different options that previous experience of a motor skill can have on learning a new motor skill. And so positive transfer is really important because that's how we sort of sequence our learning, right? So when we are learning a new sport or when we're learning, think of Gentile's taxonomy, right? There's a stepwise increase in how we want to stage the learning, right? So it's based on this whole idea of positive transfer. So hopefully I'm not confusing you guys. So the stepwise increase in difficulty of learning a new motor skill, or so that would be in practice, that would be with Gentile's taxonomy in a rehab setting. They're all based on this idea of gradually increasing difficulty because you're going to learn an easier version of the task, get used to it, and that's going to positively transfer on the next type that is a little bit more difficult, and a little bit more difficult, and a little bit more difficult. It's the same thing with like sort of school curriculum, where you have intro to movement neuroscience, and then you have neuroscience, and then you have motor control, or you would have kin 1 and then kin 2. It's all based on this idea of positive transfer of learning. Does that make sense, everyone? Perfect. And so transfer of learning is important, or positive transfer of learning is important to understand because it helps us sequence skills to be learned, but it's also used in transfer tests to assess sort of the effectiveness of practice, right? Or to sort of assess learning. Why do you think positive transfer would occur then? And so there's two different reasons, and they're both probably true, and they are true at the same time. So this idea of positive transfer occurs because of the similarity between sort of the skill and context concepts. So with positive transfer, there's probably, with Gentile's taxonomy, there's a similarity between the motor skill sort of like components with each step. So looking at the movements are very similar in terms of the skill. Looking at it cognitively, and this is the whole concept of learning to learn, there's probably a similarity in the cognitive processing required. So with positive transfer, it occurs because the movements are similar, but also because the problem solving that occurs in the brain is similar. Does that make sense, everyone? And so although rare, negative transfer can occur where previous experience hinders performance initially. And this is when, if you ever gotten into a new car, like so you're used to driving your car, you get in a car accident, you get a new car, and then initially you have a really hard time trying to figure out how to use, like you know, the shifter's in a different location, you're trying to figure out where all the buttons are, and then it kind of screws you up. Your previous experience of driving in another car has initially hindered your performance in that new car, but then that is quickly unlearned with repetition. So with practice, you can overcome the negative effects of previous experience because you unlearn the old way and then you learn the new way. Oh, did I miss anything? So negative transfer occurs as a result of three main reasons. it can happen when the so do you all remember from the motor control lecture when talking about perception action coupling, that as you become better and better at a motor skill, you couple your actions with what you're perceiving from the environment. So for example, like Tao, you are now timing your movements based on your awareness of the ball coming at you. As you become better and better at a motor skill, you time your movements with the environment. So you have perception of the environment coupled with how you act or the skill. So perception, action, coupling. So negative transfer can happen when the established perception action coupling is altered. So think of it, so think of it when the established pattern, give me an example of, like, let's say the car example. So previous experience, when I get in a car and I want to move it up, in some cars it's a button, in some cars it's a lever or something, right? So I always knew that when I got in my car and I wanted to move it forward, I would grab the lever, move it forward, and move it up, right? So perceive them too close, action, moving forward, okay? This is a really hypothetical example. Get the new car, and now all of a sudden it's not a lever, it's a button. So I would get in, and then, oh, too close or too far, go to grab, and there's no lever, and then I'd be all confused, and oh, right, it's the button. It's a different perception action coupling. Or what about, I'm trying to think of an example for you. Can anyone think of another situation where the perception action coupling would be different? Think about when you are learning out of a new keyboard. Sometimes when it's the similar task, but things are in different locations. So that's more like the example of the car that I was talking about. Things are in different places. Oh yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. Lena? So cognitive confusion is when it's a similar skill, but sort of the placement of everything is in a different position. And so it causes cognitive confusion. The last example of negative transfer is when you are using an established pattern that's different than the new one. So that was the example of a baseball player playing tennis. So the performer is attempting to utilize an old coordination pattern to achieve a new one. And remember, with negative transfer, you just have to unlearn and then unlearn the old pattern of the perception action coupling, unlearn the old pattern of the placement of where things are, or unlearn the old coordination pattern of how to achieve this skill. You unlearn it and learn the new pattern. And this is why learning is an example of transfer. So there's a rule that would suggest that the principles of learning are consistent through all types of things. So like when you're doing different courses, you have your electives. And so doing electives is annoying because sometimes it's nothing that you are super interested in. But that whole idea of having a new course, we have to consolidate the information, take notes, learn it, process it, organize it. That experience is relatable to other courses, right? Or when you are a young child and you are wanting to play, sports, what do coaches always say, right? As when we were playing hockey, they would want us to play lacrosse in the summer. They would want us to play another sport to get used to practicing and understanding our bodies. This whole idea of learning to learn, that problem-solving capability, so the academia of learning a course is applicable to all other courses. That problem-solving ability cognitively of figuring out coordination patterns, moving your body and adjusting it and adapting it is relatable to different sports. That process is similar throughout sports, even if they're different. Does that make sense, everyone? Oh, did I screw this up? Is that okay, everyone? And I just wanted to finish off with bilateral transfer. So the transfer of learning a skill with one arm will affect your ability to learn, or that will transfer to the other arm or other limb. And so I just wanted to end off with this sort of quick example of bilateral transfer, or bilateral transfer is the transfer of learning that occurs between two limbs. And so what studies have done, well, what they would do is they would do a type of motor skill that would involve one arm, and then they would have test whatever skill with both arms, and this is how they did with their dominant hand and the non-dominant hand. Then they would practice with one arm, and then complete the skill again in a test on both arms. And what they found was that practicing with, so here we had, let's say, a score of 2 out of 10, right? Practice with just the dominant hand. Now all of a sudden they've improved their ability on both sides. Is that crazy or not? And why would that be? Give me some examples of why that was observed. Anyone? Am I losing the? Oh, whoops, crap. Well, you because this was proven, and like so look it up in the textbook. And what they found, and so the reason why you can't learn with opposite hand, what they found was that the transfer of learning occurred mostly when you practiced with the dominant hand. So there's a greater amount of transfer from dominant to not dominant. And so one of the reasons why this could be is because of that whole idea of motor program, right? That you, with practice, have created a generalized motor program, and then the muscles available or the limb that you want to utilize is a parameter on top of that motor program. The other explanation is the whole cognitive explanation, which was, remember, part of learning is that cognitive stage, the problem solving in your mind. If you've already completed that with one arm, you're quicker at doing it with the other arm. And so in so what they do in hospitals, I don't know, it wasn't someone in an occupational therapy setting in a hospital where you have people practicing learning how to use a prosthetic limb with the good hand while they're waiting for the surgery for the bad limb. And so that way, when they get the surgery and then now they have to utilize the prosthetic, they have a better understanding and therefore less practice required to learn how to utilize the prosthetic limb. And that's all. This is a video about it too if you want. Yeah. So that's just bilateral transfer. Any questions, anyone? I hope that this lecture wasn't too difficult. Review it after the midterm, obviously. And remember, with the midterm, there's those that sample midterm, and there's a review PowerPoint. But you want to understand that there's the common threads throughout each of the lectures. So it'll sort of decrease the amount of information and hopefully decrease how overwhelmed you are at the material. Okay? Any questions, please email me, and then I will see you all in 2 weeks. Okay, bye everyone.